Hey everyone, it's James from SCW's product team, and I'm in the trenches. This is the second episode of this new series where we cover more in depth topics in the security camera industry. And today we're going to be talking about exposure settings. So, what is exposure? Well, exposure is the amount of light that enters a camera sensor. Um, Exposure is determined by settings within the camera. That is your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO, or also known as gain. Overly bright images are considered overexposed, where overly dark images are going to be considered underexposed. Um, Exposure settings also impact your depth of field, motion clarity, and more, which I'll cover in this presentation. So the first thing I want to talk about is aperture. So aperture controls the amount of light a lens lets in, but it also affects your depth of field. You usually don't have to worry about depth of field too much on security cameras, but if you're looking at a normal camera and happen to be watching this, the lower the aperture rating, the more your background will be blurred out. So you're more bokeh, as it's called. Apertures are also rated in f-stops, as I said. So you see f1 all the way up to 32. And the lower the number, the more light lets in, but the shallower the depth of field. So if you want to really have everything in focus, you really probably want to go jump up to one of these. Um, and aperture varies from lens to lens. Some will only go up to f16 and be from 2.8 to 16, and some might be 1 to 22, and so on. So look, if you're looking shopping for normal cameras, the aperture varies. Um, let's also talk about shutter speed. So shutter speed affects the amount of light that hits a sensor as well. So the higher the shutter speed, the less light gets let in, but your motion is going to be clearer. The lower the shutter speed, the more light is let in, but the blurrier the motion is. Shutter speeds are measured in a fraction of a second. This is a decent graph at showing like 8,000. What you're going to look at, everything's very clear here at 1,000, but as you go slower and slower, things get blurrier and blurrier. I think a lot of people expect that this is a product of frames per second, which is not actually true. Frames per second does impact how smooth the image looks, but the actual clarity of motion is the shutter speed actually. The third thing is ISO, which used to refer to your film speed when you bought a camera. You know, you put your film in and would have a certain speed for it. But today it's more of like a gain sensing setting on the digital sensor. Excuse me. The higher the ISO, the more light gets in. However, the noisier the image gets. Too much ISO, and you're gonna have a really grainy image. ISO performance varies significantly from your camera to camera. So a newer camera with a newer sensor is probably going to do better at different ISO levels than an older camera. If you set your ISO or your gain too high, you know, you are going to affect some clarity and color accuracy as well. And it's important to know that within the video and security camera world, like high ISO is actually even worse for video than it is in still images because it's going to affect your motion and everything like that. So here is a comparison of a 100 ISO, which is usually the lowest on most cameras. And you can see it's obviously very clear and clean, whereas 3200 is very noisy and grainy, and that's going to affect your detail level in the image. But James, don't we sell security cameras? What are you talking about here? Well, security cameras are still cameras. Almost all security cameras have adjustable shutter speed and ISO or gain. Most, though, have fixed non-adjustable apertures. Most situations require little to no adjustment. Most cameras you go and you put up, they're going to be good. There are some situations where that's not true, though. Manual situation where you're going to have to probably tweak things, license plates. I'll have an entire presentation on this later on, but there's a lot of things you're going to have to tweak and make sure you get right in order to consistently get license plates in most situations. Um, Another place where you may want to tweak the shutter speed, for example, is when you have somebody that's really close to the camera. You may, if you have any cameras that are in like a really tight lobby or something like that, and it's just not quite clear when somebody goes by. That's probably the shutter speed being too low. Cameras in difficult lighting situations, you know, if you're in like an area where there's a lot of shadow, maybe you're in like a facility where you got big windows, but inside it's not quite as well lit. So you have really well lit areas and really dark areas. We can talk about the settings that help that. But any area where you have a really fast moving objects or really close objects like production lines, cars, etc., um, there may be a situation where you have to adjust that as well. I want to make a video here, or show you a video, I should say. I already made it. And this is going to compare shutter speed in that kind of tight situation I showed. So I'm walking at as similar a distance as I can. This first one is 130 shutter speed. Oops, excuse me. 130 shutter speed is the pretty standard shutter speed for most security cameras, although some vary, some more 160 or 150 as well. And you can see at 130, when I'm that close to a camera, 6 feet away, I'm not very clear. If I adjust that up to 160 and I walk by, you'll start to notice it without even pausing, it's much more clear. But at 6 feet, it's still um, traversing that image very quickly. At a 120, you'll see the difference as well. And one thing you notice at 120, because that center is letting in less light, I'm a little bit more grainy here. So it is a double-edged sword. It is a balancing act that, if I went up to the next shutter speed, I'd be even grainier. So you have to find that balance for each location. 6 feet is very close to a camera, so that's not a typical situation. Usually 130 is pretty good, and 160 is even better for those situations, but do consider that in those situations. So again, I was about 6 feet away, walking at a normal pace on a 2.8 millimeter lens. That might be very similar to a small little lobby. Um, Many security cameras, as I mentioned, are just 130 shutter speed. And again, the tighter the shot, the closer the subject, the more that shutter speed matters. And 130, as you saw, does struggle a little bit with that tighter shot. So here's another example. I talked about this earlier when it comes um, to shutter speed and frames per second. So let's watch this video here. And what I did is went ahead and paused it and zoomed in, and we will see that this is a camera that was set to 30 frames a second at 130 shutter. And you can see that these vehicles are just pretty blurry. They're streaking by, and those cars are going 50 to 60 miles an hour though as well. So keep that in mind. And here is another example. What I've adjusted here is actually set the shutter speed to just 15 frames a second, but adjusted the shutter speed. I'm sorry, I adjusted the frames per second to 15 and the shutter speed to 1/500. So what does that give us? Well, the cars are a lot more clear. They're not as streaky, even though the frames per second is cut in half. Well, again, that's because actual motion clarity is a result of the shutter speed, not the frames per second. Let's talk about ISO a little bit. This is an option on our cameras. I can't speak for everybody else's camera, but your gain is an option. So gain allows additional light, but it is going to introduce a noisier image. So you can adjust it on different scales. If you adjust it too much, you can see here on this camera that it's a very not very clean image. Although if you're in a low light situation, that may be better um, than getting nothing at all. So consider that as an option when you're adjusting your settings. Let's talk about other image settings here. So WDR, that's wide dynamic range. Essentially what WDR does, there's two variations really. There's true WDR and there's digital. True WDR is sort of taking two images at the same time with two different image settings. So it's taking one for a little bit more shadowy and one that's a little bit more light, and it's actually combining them. Whereas digital, it's just sort of a enhancement thing, doesn't work very well. Shadows are, I should say, not very good for security cameras. If you're looking and you're trying to get the best image possible, you really want a flat image that doesn't have a lot of shadows, even if it doesn't look that appealing. You're not trying to submit probably your security camera footage into any kind of beauty contest. You're looking to get faces, you're looking to get details. White balance, let's talk about that. White balance determines how cool or warm an image looks like, and I'll show you an example of that. Another one that should be adjusted a little bit more often than maybe it is sharpness. So you think sharpness, you always want a sharper image, right? But that does introduce some artifacts as well. So if you over sharpen an image, certain areas on a security camera system, like your pavement, your grass, and stuff like that, will look really noisy and kind of ugly, and some for a lot of people distracting. So here's some images here. You can see on the left here, I've turned WDR off. It's very hard to see him because this area to the left is very well lit. This is under a shadow. It's under an eave. So, but as soon as I turned on WDR, it's getting both areas very well. There's still a shadow, but it's getting his face there. So it's a really good idea to turn WDR on and adjust the levels when you do have areas where you get a lot of shadows like that. Here's another example. So this is an incorrect. This is way too yellow of a white balance. Certain types of lights can trick a camera. Like let's just say I know one customer I helped with that had a beer sign in the bar that was right next to the camera that was blaring red on the image. So the camera thought the image was a lot more red than it actually was. So it was, giving kind of this sort of vibe where it was a really red image and didn't look natural, whereas this white balance on the right here is correct. Most security cameras do an amazing job at white balance, in my experience. So usually don't have to adjust this, but if you're in a tricky situation like that, you can adjust it and do it manually as well for most cameras. Here's the example of the sharpness I talked about. So this is the same or similar image. And you can see this low sharpness where I just to kind of a little bit below normal. It's a lot cleaner though. So you can see like things aren't quite as just, there's a lot of like little dots in here that may not look the best. And if somebody's further away from the camera, that can adjust, that can affect actually, I should say, how clear somebody's face is going to be. Because if you introduce a lot of noise to the image, there's going to be a lot of noise on a person's face as well, just like there is over there. So as you put up your cameras and you're looking at the settings and you're trying to see how good it looks, consider adjusting that sharpness bar up or excuse me, down a little bit, and just move it up and down depending on your model. Every camera out of the box has kind of a different level of sharpness, so everyone's going to vary a little bit. One last thing, TVs. I talked about this actually last week when I answered the question of whether you need a 4K TV to appreciate a 4K camera. But one thing that's more true than ever as TVs have really dropped in price is more security camera customers use TVs for their displays, which is which is great. However, TVs have a couple different settings. They're usually on by default that can affect your security camera footage. Like some will crop out the left and sometimes right sides of the top and bottom, I should say, and sometimes left and right of the image to try to get rid of those black bars you see in TV shows and stuff. And that can crop out some of the menus. So you usually want to go into the settings and make sure you're doing an option that isn't cropping. Otherwise, you may not be able to see all of the image. Um, Another thing that most TVs do, especially the lower end TVs, they tend to have like sharpness enhancements. So they'll grab the image from the NVR, which is already sharpened from the NVR, and then they'll try to sharpen it more, which can actually introduce a ton of artifacts. Um, so watch that setting on your TV. There are also other like noise reduction settings, which ironically can also introduce noise as well. So watch that as you are looking at your TV. Look at your TV settings just as much as you're looking at your camera settings and some. Another huge thing that I see a lot is some people will put a TV way up high or maybe on an angle, and a lot of TVs aren't meant to be looked at that kind of angle. They're meant to be straight on where you're looking at it. You've got to make sure that the TV is not adjusting like as you look at that bad angle, that the contrast isn't dramatically affected or the color clarity. Because especially at night vision, where it's a very contrasty image, if you're looking at it from way up here, that may not be an image that looks exactly like actually it does on the security system. So you may be adjusting your settings based on this TV that's actually not giving you the correct image. I would recommend bringing it up on like your phone or something like that as you adjust it, so you can tell like, why does this TV look a lot darker or why does it look brighter? Because it's very likely a potential addition to the TV. All right, so let's conclude this presentation for today. And the conclusion is that one camera in the exact same situation can produce a radically different image based on those image settings we talked about. In some situation, tweaks are required or recommended. And honestly, tweak your cameras to your heart's desire. Like if you forget the setting or you don't know what you're don't remember what you changed, there's usually a default setting, at least on our cameras, where you can go back and go back to the factory settings. If you don't have a default setting, just make sure you remember, hey, I adjusted the sharpness a little bit left or no, or a little bit right, and do it in steps. Don't make big changes. Do it, 20% here, 20% here, 20% here. So that way you can tell the difference and you can find the sweet spot. Also check that in day and night footage. If you adjust something and primarily you're only looking at the settings when you're in day mode, the night mode could actually have need a totally different set of settings. So consider that as well. If you have SCW cameras, give our support team a call. They can help you optimize these cameras and make the setting changes and show you how to tweak them as well. Just reach out to us at www.getscw.com. Our support number and support chat's right there as well. And we'll be glad to help you. And if you just have any general questions, feel free to reach out to us. I hope you found this episode useful. Look forward to seeing you next time on In the Trenches.